Hi, good afternoon. My name's James Roby. I lead the environmental sustainability agenda for Capgemini. And this afternoon, I would like to talk to you about solutions from the planet. And hopefully somebody will bring me a clicker and some slides will appear. Or maybe not. Can somebody bring me a clicker so we can have some slides? Thank you. Fantastic. All the best laid plans. So what I want to do this afternoon is start by explaining a little bit of the context. I think it's always good to go back to the context of why we're in the situation we're in. Then start looking at some of the solutions which are out there already and can be scaled and can make a real difference. And then just conclude a little bit and think about the future. So let's start with the context. So climate change, ultimately, it's all down to carbon. Now, carbon is permanently in flux. It's permanently moving between the oceans, the forests, the atmosphere, and for billions of years, it's been in balance within a relatively stable levels. But starting with the Industrial Revolution, we have started to put enormous quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. Currently, we're putting about 40 gigatons, 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. And what's relevant is thinking about where it comes from and where it goes. So this chart just gives you a snapshot of that. You can see the majority of it's coming from CO2, from the burning of fossil fuels, and probably about 10% from changes in land use, deforestation, and other things. Now, that 40 billion tons has to go somewhere. About a quarter of it goes into the oceans, not without problems. It's actually acidifying the oceans, a real problem for corals and other creatures in the oceans. About a third of it is going into plants. Actually, the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the easier it is for plants to absorb CO2 and grow. The problem, of course, comes with the remainder. So you can see here, about half of it gets left in the atmosphere. And that's what's driving up the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. I'm sure most of us have seen this chart, this historical NASA chart, showing CO2 levels within a reasonably constant balance, and then in the last 50 years or so, jumping up from about 280 parts per million up to where we are at the moment, which is just approaching 420 parts per million. So that's CO2. But CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas. 40 billion isn't the only or the full scale of the challenge. We have emissions coming from methane, we have emissions coming from nitrous oxide, and a number of other gases. And they effectively increase the amount from that 40 billion number to the 50 billion number. So we talk about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent going into the atmosphere every year. Now, this is the number that if you read Bill Gates' book last year, he talks about the two numbers you need to know, 50 billion and 0. This is the 50 billion. This is the CO2 equivalent going into the atmosphere. Our last speaker talked a little bit about the latest IPCC report, and tucked in there, what I'd like to show you now is probably the most crucial table. And it looks like this. And apologies, it's rather full of numbers, but let me just try and break it down for you. So first of all, the top part of the table is about history. This is about the CO2 that we've put in the atmosphere over the last 150, 200 years. And you can see that's about plus or minus 2,400 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that 2,400 billion has driven an increase in the temperature of around about 1 degree. So scientists are reasonably unanimous that we're about 1.5 degrees. So that's the looking backward piece of the table. The next bit looks forward. Now, we all know the Paris Agreement, and we all know the ambition to keep temperature levels within 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial temperatures. Remember, we've already gone up 1 degree, so we've only got half a degree left of headroom. And that's what this top column is. And the top column says, how many more tons of CO2 can we put in the atmosphere if we want to stay at 1.5 degrees? And the 5 columns are a percentage probability. So if I take the 67% column, so this says if we want a 2/3 chance, a 67% chance that we can stay within 1.5 degrees, then we can emit another 400 billion tons, another 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, of course, it's not quite that. This is from the beginning of 2020. So we've already had 2 years. So approximately 80 billion tons has been emitted into the atmosphere. So 320 is the magic number. We can afford to put another 320 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, or put another way, we can do another 8 years based on our current rate of pumping out carbon dioxide. Of course, if we do another 8 years, in year number 9, that would be 2030, we would have to be at 0 carbon dioxide. So clearly you can see the importance of decarbonizing rapidly, because every ton of carbon we don't emit this year is a ton of carbon we can emit after 2030. The final part of the table just points to that there are other greenhouse gases, and it recognizes that we need to decarbonize and stop emitting those greenhouse gases as well. Because if we don't, then we will significantly reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that we can put out. So that's the context, that's the situation we're in. This is the challenge. It's all about cumulative emissions that matter, and that's what we need to address. So what I'd like to do now is move on to the second part of the presentation, which is about building solutions. Now, I work for a technology company. I think many of us watching are in the tech industry. The conference is obviously sponsored by Microsoft. Now, technology has 2 parts. We have to acknowledge that technology is actually one of the challenges. Technology has an enormous carbon footprint of its own. In fact, if the tech sector was a country, the tech sector emits about 3% of all carbon dioxide emissions. That's significantly more than the aviation sector was emitting pre-COVID, and that is more than the whole of the carbon emissions of France, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. So technology has a responsibility to clean itself up. But technology also delivers an enormous possibility in terms of what it can deliver. It's been calculated that technology can have a 10-fold impact on decarbonizing the other sectors. And actually, the little icon at the bottom, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's been shown that digital technology, digital solutions can contribute to all 17 of the goals. So let's think about how we now might address those goals. Now, there are 5 big areas. If we look at energy, agriculture, industry, transportation, and buildings, combined, they account for about 90% of all the greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. So I will talk about each of those in turn. And we should also remember nature. This is the decade of nature ecosystem restoration, as declared by the United Nations. And nature itself can have an enormous impact in terms of reducing and helping abate carbon. So let's dive into some examples, starting with energy. So 3 solutions. Now, whenever you see these solutions and there's a little icon next to it, that means I've taken these solutions from a report called Fit for Net Zero, a report Capgemini did about 15 months ago, looking at 55 technology quests to make a difference on climate change. So the first one is bifacial solar panels. Traditional solar panels collect energy from one direction only. Bifacial solar panels can connect energy from 2 directions, typically from the sun directly, and secondly from the ground, reflected heat coming up from the ground. A bifacial solar panel can collect approximately 9% more energy than a traditional panel. And if you combine that with solar panels that actually track the sun through the day, you can get up to about 40% more energy out of those solar panels. Secondly, floating wind farms. Offshore wind is an enormous opportunity across Europe. We are exploiting it heavily, but traditional offshore wind needs to be in relatively shallow water, less than 60 meters. And 80% of the possible wind fields we have in Europe are deeper than that. There are big ones off the coast of Portugal, and actually, if we were investing in floating wind, we think we can abate 300 million tons of carbon by switching to floating wind farms. Direct air capture is also going to be critical. It's still a bit of a technology shot at the moment. It's still a new technology, but it's not going to be the panacea. It's not going to deliver all of the carbon savings we need, but it will be an important part of the journey. So that's energy. Moving on to agriculture, and we called it Agriculture 4.0. This is agriculture where we bring together traditional agriculture with artificial intelligence, with big data, with robots, with digitization. And actually, if you add satellite data in there, you can come up with some very smart ways of improving the productivity of nature, of agriculture. Capgemini has been involved in a project called Project Farm. That project actually provides intelligent farming data for rural farmers in countries like Kenya. And by providing them data, actually as simple as SMS-based data around weather, they can absolutely optimize the way they grow their crops. They can optimize when they harvest and when they take them to the market. So technology can make an enormous difference. I won't talk about meat alternatives because the previous speaker covered that one. Number 3, industry. Number of areas here. The go-to production material for industry at the moment is concrete. We build pretty much everything out of concrete. It needs to be decarbonized. Concrete alone is about 2% of all global emissions. And people are looking at the inputs to concrete, particularly around clinker, and they're also looking at the processes for making concrete, and also challenging the design processes around concrete. And actually, how do we make our industry, our buildings, using much, much less of it? Plant efficiency is another enormous opportunity. Here in Europe, we use about 400 trillion watt-hours every year in driving motors, pumps, compressors, and they are mostly significantly inefficient. You can go back as far as 20 years to work done by Paul Hawken and his colleagues in the work of natural capitalism, and you can find great examples about how we can significantly drive down the carbon intensity and the energy use in most factories. Plastics, we in Europe produce about 60 million tons of it a year, most of it from virgin fossil fuels. There's a huge opportunity for recycling and reusing. Next one, transportation. Well, we all know that there is a transportation revolution going on the moment, a migration to electric vehicles. We're going to need the infrastructure behind that if we're going to successfully make that shift. Probably electricity, batteries for cars in the short term, probably hydrogen for trucks and moving heavy goods. Intelligent routing is also critical. We've done some projects where we've helped logistics companies just save enormous quantities of diesel just by the way that you drive, where you route, and the way you encourage drivers to drive more efficiently. You know, save 1 million litres of diesel, you save about 3,500 tons of carbon emissions, plus less embedded carbon, less pollution, less congestion, and so on and so on. And the 5th area is buildings. Now, buildings, particularly in Europe, tend to be old, they tend to be inefficient, they tend to be in need of huge amounts of insulation if we're going to be able to switch the heating from fossil fuels to electricity. I just want to finish with a really interesting example on intelligent use, and this is about commercial real estate. An office in the Netherlands realized that it didn't matter what they did with the air conditioning systems, there were certain parts of the building that would always be hot, and there were other parts that would always be cold. So rather than spending huge amount of energy not succeeding, they gave all of their employees an app which enabled them to select their preferences. Some people love to sit in a hot corner. Some people love to sit in a cool area. So rather than trying to change the impossible, change the environment in the building, why not give the people the opportunity to go to sit where is comfortable for them? So there's just a snapshot of some of the solutions. I mentioned nature. I mean, the best thing we can do with forests is just simply not cut them down. Seaweed is another fascinating new economy that's growing up, an economy that could save nearly 300 million tons of carbon every year. Seaweed is a great source of food. Actually, if you feed cows on it, they produce a lot less methane. We're also using it in pharma. We're finding anti-cancer drugs in there. There's almost no end to what we're seeing we can do with seaweed. So huge amounts of opportunity in terms of using nature to help us mitigate climate risks. It's been estimated that 37% of the carbon savings we need over the next 10 years could come from nature. So where are we going next? The future. Well, again, many of you will have seen this chart. Again, it's an IPCC scenarios chart, basically saying if we just carried on as normal, business as usual, we'll probably end up with 4 or 5 degrees of climate change. I won't go to what that might look like, but it basically is the end of the world as we would recognize it. Now, where we need to get to is the 1.5 degree pathway, the Paris pathway. This chart was done before the COP26 conference. You can see current pledges then were about 2.7 to 3 degrees. And, the pledges were there. The policies were at about 2.4. Now, at COP, we had some good news. Governments upped their ambitions. The pledges now add to about 1.8 degrees, so not 1.5, but starting to go in the right direction. But do remember there is a gap between the pledges and the policies. We need governments to follow through. The critical bit here is this piece here. We need to halve emissions by 50% between 2020 and 2030. Now that means, in reality, a reduction of about 7.6% year on year, every year through this decade. So that's the scale of the challenge. We've never achieved anything like that before, or never before until 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic came along, and we all went home, we were all locked down, and energy use and carbon emissions dramatically dropped. In fact, in April 2020, which was the peak of the lockdowns globally, carbon emissions were down about 18%. You can see on this chart, they dropped significantly in April, and then they started to come up again as we started to unlock the economies of the world. Now, overall, if we pull that together, we discover that the carbon emissions in 2020 were down about 7%. So not quite the 7.6% required by the Paris Agreement, but almost. So you could say, in some ways, a good start to our challenge in terms of decarbonisation. Of course, I don't think anybody would agree that this was a good way to decarbonise the economy, and clearly there's been a huge amount of personal and human suffering which has come across that drop. But it does give us a sense of the scale of the change which is needed over the next few years. So, of course, that was 2020. 2021, we started to unlock the economies a little bit more, we started to see a little bit more travel, and of course we started to see a rebound. Now, the reality of that rebound is about 5%. We haven't got the final figures yet, they're still being calculated, but we think that in 2021, CO2 emissions went back up 5%. So if you look at the Paris pathway, which says at the end of last year, we should have been 2 years in, so 2 lots of 7.6, we should have been about 15% down on 2019 levels, and the reality is that we are about 2% down on 2019 levels. So again, we're making our lives increasingly harder. I think the critical point, and the critical point for this, the message here is, we still think there is a window of opportunity, but that window is small and is getting smaller. That's why we need to act. The Fit for 55 report, the link is on the slides there, gives you 55 proven suggested quests, which we think in combination could deliver about 2.5 billion tons of carbon saving. At the same point, they could add about $1.5 trillion to the global economy and could create about 24 million new jobs. So again, we have to think about how are we going to transform our economy. We can't decarbonize just by shutting everything down. We have to decarbonize by transitioning into something in the future. So this report suggests a whole range of quests. This report isn't going to be sufficient to get us, those 55 quests are not going to get us everywhere, but they will start us on that journey. And I guess the message here is, don't think about these quests as an either and, we can do this one or this one or this one. Realistically, we need to do all of them. We need to do all of these and more if we're going to successfully decarbonize the economy. So in conclusion, in the last minute, I'd just like to leave you with 3 numbers, 320, 8, and 1. So the first of those numbers you'll remember from the presentation, 320 gigatons of CO2. This is the amount of CO2 that we can afford to put into the atmosphere and still have a good chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. If you like, you can think of it as our carbon budget. Second number 8. 8 years. If we carry on pumping out CO2 at the current rates, that's how much longer we've got. So if you think about it, effectively, 1, one chance. We've got one chance to do something, to act now for the future. As I say, every 10 million or every million or even every ton of carbon we save now is a ton that we can use in the future. Thank you.